Moorish, Orthodox, Radio, Crusade, Anarchism for the Global City, Radical Environmentalism for the Concrete Jungle, Esoteric Explorations of the Secret History of Rebel Culture, the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, exiled from WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City, now only on the World Wide Web. Be there.
Well, welcome aboard to the first internet edition of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, which is now exiled from its former home at WBAI, New York City's non-commercial radio station, affiliate of the Pacifica Network. And given that this is the inauguration of our electronic-only edition, I guess what I should do is I should tell the story of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade and what are its origins, why it has such a seemingly esoteric name, and how it came to be exiled from WBAI. And this is a rather tortuous story, which takes a lot of twists and turns. And it is going to go to the far ends of the earth before returning back here to the New York metropolitan area. But it really begins in Newark, New Jersey in 1916 with a man called Timothy Drew, today known to his followers as the Prophet, Noble Drew Ali, who founded a doctrine today little known in the general public, but has had a wider influence than is generally recognized, called Moorish science. And it was in Newark, New Jersey in 1916 that he unveiled this book, which I have a copy of right here, entitled The Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple of America, divinely prepared by the noble prophet Drew Ali, more popularly known as the Circle 7 Quran, due to the esoteric symbol of a 7 in a circle, never explained to the best of my knowledge, which has always adorned its cover. And basically, this was an important precursor to the Black Muslim movement. Noble Drew basically propounded the doctrine that there was once a great Moorish civilization which prospered on both sides of the Atlantic in ancient times. And this is linked to the theorizing about the lost continents and Atlantis and so on, which served as a land bridge between the great Moorish civilizations of ancient America and those of North Africa and what we think of as the contemporary Moorish world. And he held that what are popularly known as black folks, or at the time Negroes, were in fact the Moors and the inheritors of this great civilization. And he was all about identity. He was all about recovering what he believed to be the true identity of black folk in this country, and gained quite a following initially in the city of Chicago, which he considered to be the North American Mecca. After initially promulgating the doctrine in Newark, he found a following in Chicago on into the 1920s, and it was in Chicago that among his early followers was none other than the man who would become Elijah Muhammad and would go on to found the Nation of Islam, as is explained in this book, The Messenger, The Rise and Fall of Elijah Muhammad by Carl Evans, another fascinating book, which has got quite a few in the early sections of this book. It's got quite a few discussions of Moorish science and the noble Drew Ali. But it must be said that Elijah Muhammad took the doctrine in more of a racialist direction. Noble Drew Ali never talked about race; he talked about nationality, and he talked about a universal brotherhood, and learning to love instead of hate was one of his slogans, one of his doctrines. So while Elijah Muhammad was very, very clearly influenced and took a lot from Moorish science and the noble Drew, he also brought it in a different direction. The Moorish science movement was in many ways militant and revolutionary, but it was not a doctrine of racial hatred or even really of racial separatism. But it was about recovering what noble Drew Ali felt was or propagated as the true identity of black folks in this country as Moors, who were part of the great Asiatic race, which basically referred to all non-white peoples. So they came under some persecution for avoiding the draft in the First World War, and there was some internecine factionalism which emerged in the movement, and it's after Noble Drew's death, under somewhat mysterious circumstances, the movement fragmented and was sort of superseded by Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam eventually. Certainly by the 1950s that was the case. So now we're already up to the 1950s. You're starting probably, if you're not one of the initiates of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, you're probably wondering what this has to do with us. Well, that's just what we're getting to. Just around this period in the late 1950s, in the city of Baltimore, there were a bunch of white beatnik types who were into Sufism and Persian poetry and Islamic and Eastern culture and mysticism generally, who fell into the orbit of the local Moorish Science Temple in Baltimore, which was run by a guy by the name of Timothy Dingle Eel, who portrayed himself as the successor to, and in fact the reincarnation of, the noble Drew Ali. And these young white beatniks and spiritual seekers were sort of given a franchise, so to speak, in the Moorish Science movement by Timothy Dingle Eel and his Moorish Science Temple in Baltimore. And they established something which was which came to be known. Well, initially it was the Noble Order of Moors and Sufis, I believe, but later became known as the Moorish Orthodox Church. And in this circle of, again, young beatnik spiritual seekers who founded the Moorish Orthodox Church was a man by the name of Peter Lamborn Wilson. And they, even though they were sort of eclectic and drawing from a lot of different sources, particularly Sufism, they were, like I say, sort of given an unofficial franchise and sort of recognized by the Moorish movement. And there was this this notion that, okay, Peter Lamborn Wilson, for instance, is an Irishman, and there was this notion that the Irish too could be a part of the greater Asiatic nation, having been oppressed peoples in Europe and in America, and that so-called white folks could affiliate with the Moorish movement as Persians, and therefore be a part of the greater Asiatic nation, along with the Moorish Americans, or as we would to put it in more popular terms, black folks. So there was a certain element of the Moorish Orthodox Church which was sort of tongue-in-cheek, sort of a joke religion, quote-unquote, but there was another side of it which was actually quite serious. And there really was some genuine spiritual seeking here, and certainly a genuine sense of camaraderie and solidarity with the Moorish science movement, which ironically, of course, is actually the more Orthodox movement, and the Moorish Orthodox Church is the less Orthodox and the more eclectic movement, and the one which is more of a tutti frutti and a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also with its serious side. So I always say that in the name of our radio show, the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, the only word which we can't actually defend in some sense, the only word in that phrase which is actually completely tongue-in-cheek is the word Orthodox. Of course, we're completely unorthodox. You might say that we're orthodoxly unorthodox. Is the only sense in which you could consider us to be actually orthodox. An orthodox commitment to our unorthodoxy. But in any event, this story is told in two books by Peter Lamborn Wilson: Scandal, Essays in Islamic Heresy, and Sacred Drift, Essays on the Margins of Islam, which has got lovely collage art on the cover with a cutout of the noble Drew Ali being the centerpiece. So both of these are published by Autonomous Media, and they tell the whole story of the origins of the Moorish Orthodox Church. Now, sometime about just about the time that I was being born, probably just about 1962 or thereabouts, Peter Lamborn Wilson and a couple of his comrades from the Moorish Orthodox Church wound up doing a special on WBAI for just 1 hour, in which they played Otis Redding music and read Sufi poetry and just sort of, hammed it up a little bit and knocked it around. I've never actually heard it. I'm not sure that it's been preserved for posterity. If anybody out there has actually got a recording of it, I'd love to get my hands on it. But I believe they called that episode the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. And that was it. For many, many years to come, that was it. Just a one-shot, once on WBAI back sometime in the early 1960s. Not even quite sure of the date, but I think it was just about the year I was born, 1962. And then the various members of the Moorish Orthodox Church, one by one, started making the journey to the east. And Peter Lamborn Wilson traveled all the way from, I believe, Morocco, straight across the Islamic world to Indonesia, and studying Sufism and meeting with spiritual masters and remarkable men along the way, and went through Persia and Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, and finally settled down in Iran for quite a few years, and was involved in translation work there, and involved in theater work, and finally came 1979. He had to leave due to the revolution, and he came back to New York City, which is where he was from. And this was a very interesting time. I remember it well. I didn't know Peter at this point, but this was certainly a big turning point in my life. 1980 was the year that I graduated from high school. It's also the year that Reagan was elected, and the year of the hostage crisis in Iran, and the year of the big lurch to the right here in American society, from which we have never recovered, as the current headlines from Washington, D.C. make entirely too clear. So Peter gets back to New York just in time for this big sense of cultural backlash, and gets politicized. And I believe that he had always considered himself to be an anarchist, but he had been more of a spiritual anarchist and more of a quietistic anarchist up until this point. Back in New York in the 1980s, he became involved with a group by the name of the Libertarian Book Club, which is where I entered the picture, because I had also gravitated just at about this time to the Libertarian Book Club. We should do a little bit of explaining here that the Libertarian Book Club uses the name libertarian not in the sense in which it is popularly understood today. The Libertarian Book Club was founded in 1946 by old-school left-wing anarchist exiles from fascist Europe, mostly Jews and Italians. And back at this time, the word libertarian had not yet been subject to, by this time I mean 1946, the word libertarian had not yet been subject to a hostile takeover by the free market right. And it just basically meant anti-authoritarian. And it was a word which was used by left-wing anarchists more than the right-wing free marketeers who have unfortunately appropriated the word today. So the Libertarian Book Club, as I say, was founded by these some of these old cats from the 1940s, including, by the way, one of the original founders, a guy by the name of Jack Frazier, who had actually met Emma Goldman. So here on the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade website, you can see our two heroes, our two culture heroes, the noble Drew Ali and Emma Goldman. And we've got a quote from the noble Drew Ali's Circle 7 Quran, 1916, and Emma Goldman's essay, Anarchism, what it really stands for, 1917. So these two figures who seemed rather disparate were both writing at the same time. But their two lineages sort of come together with Peter Lamborn Wilson in the 1980s, because he had, again, he had this lineage going back to Moorish science. And was sort of a spiritual anarchist, but then got involved with these real old-school anarchists in the old-school left-wing ideological political anarchists in the Libertarian Book Club. Should we take a brief break? Welcome back. So we're going to, we've just gotten up to the Libertarian Book Club, and how Peter Lamborn Wilson and I met. Well, Peter Lamborn Wilson became sort of the leading light, the sort of underground intellectual figure and the big draw at the Libertarian Book Club, their most popular speaker and so on in this period. Now we're talking about the 1980s. But before that, the leading light had been, or one of the leading lights had been the anarchist historian Paul Avrich. And I've got here a copy of his first book, which here published in 1967 by Princeton University Press, The Russian Anarchists, Studies of the Russian Institute at Columbia University by Paul Avrich. This is sort of the book which put him on the map as the foremost scholar of the history of revolutionary anarchism in America. And that was his first book, published in 1967. His last book, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of because it's prohibitively expensive, I've got to get a copy, is Anarchist Voices, published, this is the last thing he published before he died, which must have been about, 10 years ago now. And in Anarchist Voices, he actually, it's sort of an oral history. He interviews a lot of the people who had founded the Libertarian Book Club. Managed to interview them before they died. There aren't any of the original founders left anymore. So a lot of these old Jewish and Italian anarchists who had fled Hitler and Mussolini were, their stories and their memories are preserved for posterity in this book, Anarchist Voices. So that will give you a sense, if you're interested, of what the Libertarian Book Club is all about and what its history is. And well, basically it did publish anarchist material. It was more of a book club in the early years of its existence. But by the time I got involved, it was really the publishing aspect of it had been farmed off to Autonomedia, a sort of a sibling institution. Really what we were doing was organizing the Anarchist Forum series, which were a lecture series which we held monthly. I'm using the past tense. We've actually, jumping ahead of myself, we're starting to revive the Anarchist Book Club now. But the Anarchist Forum was the major activity of the Libertarian Book Club. As I say, Peter was the biggest draw at these forums. Now, basically, what had happened is, as the old folks had started to get old and started to dwindle, basically, some new blood came in with the, beginning in just before. I mean, I was really a part of the. Of the second wave. I was sort of the tail end of the second wave. It really started just before I got involved in the 1970s. Sort of, a whole sort of neo-anarchist crowd. People who had sort of rediscovered the doctrine. People who were coming out of the New Left and had moved towards an interest in anarcho-syndicalism, founded Workers' Solidarity Alliance, and more of the sort of the people in Peter's ideological orbit, which we might call post-situationist, drawing from the ideas of Guy Debord, sort of post-hippies and ecstaticists, if you will, started getting on board and breathing new life into the organization. And I was sort of a part of that. I was sort of came in on the tail end of that second wave, as did Anne-Marie Hendrickson, who would also later be involved in the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, and Sharon Gregory. But I'm jumping ahead of myself once again, because it was also, I believe, it was in 1988 that Peter Lamborn Wilson started doing the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade on WBAI. He actually started doing it on a regular weekly basis. I believe at that time it was on Mondays at midnight. And he inherited the show. That's sort of the way things work at BAI. Usually you inherited a show from somebody else. It's kind of feudalistic. So we inherited the show from James Irsay, who under whose auspices it was known as Primary Sources. He got tired of doing Primary Sources, and he turned it over to Peter Lamborn Wilson, who changed the name to the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. And this was a bit of a joke. In fact, it wasn't a bit of a joke. It was entirely a joke. That's political satire, if that isn't clear to you. I mean, this was the 1980s, and there were all of these Christian radio crusades, which were, saturating the airwaves. And his idea was, that we were going to do the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, and it was a bunch of anarchists and freaks and people who were interested in heretical Eastern mysticism. We were going to do our own Radio Crusade. So Peter did the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade beginning in 1988. And, of course, I was an avid listener. And I believe it was in 1991 or 1992 that I started coming in as Peter's understudy. When he was out of town or traveling, I would sit in for him. And slowly he got tired of doing the show, and by degrees turned it over to me. And I became the host. And eventually I brought in my own co-hosts, Anne-Marie Hendrickson and Sharon Gregory. And for a while there, we actually had a sizable collective. Bob McGill came in as our engineer. So, Max Schmid, who's a part of the operations staff at WBAI, was at least a de facto member of the collective. So we actually had quite a sizable collective at our greatest extent in the 1990s. And then over the course of the past 10 years or so, it began to fall more and more on my shoulders. And initially, my interest was in anarchism, and I was very much a rationalist and an atheist, and in fact I remain a rationalist and an atheist. And the name of the show just struck me as bizarre and didn't really mean very much to me when I first started doing it. And I actually felt a little bit alienated from the name and a little bit embarrassed by the name, to tell you the truth, but I didn't really feel like, given that I had inherited the show from Peter Lamborn Wilson, and it was really still his show, at least in the early years, and I was taking it over by degrees, I didn't really want to change the name either. Well, lo and behold, I found that the name sort of grew on me over the years, and I suppose I should toot my own horn here. I should grab a copy of my own book. In the early years of the show, I was speaking rather fanatically about the situation with the Zapatista revolt in Mexico. This is the book I wrote about it, Homage to Chiapas, the New Indigenous Struggles in Mexico. And also we did an awful lot of programming about, just because nobody else was, we did an awful lot of programming specifically from an anarchist, anti-authoritarian, anti-militarist, pacifist perspective on the crisis in the Balkans, which was hot and heavy in those years back in the 1990s. While the left in New York City in this period was sort of divided between the what we might call the neo-interventionists or the laptop bombardiers who were rooting for NATO, and the sort of neo-fascist idiot left factions such as the Workers' World Party and its various front groups like the International Action Center, who were actually rooting for Slobodan Milosevic. There was actually very few people on the left in New York City or in the United States or in the West who were taking a real sort of single standard, neither nor anti-war position, which is what we were trying to do. One of the moments which I'm most proud of in the history of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade was, I believe it would have been around 93 or 94, when the war was still going on in Croatia and Bosnia, and there was no telephone communication, not even any telephone communication between Croatia and Bosnia and Serbia. and the anti-war activists who opposed their own governments and stood for draft resistance and anti-militarism and ethnic coexistence in both in Serbia, in Belgrade, and in Zagreb, in Croatia. They couldn't talk to each other. They had no contact with each other because all the lines of communication had been cut off. So what we did, with the help of some expats from the former Yugoslavia here in New York City, who hooked us up with some good connections, we actually did even though they couldn't call. If you were in Zagreb, you couldn't call Belgrade, and if you were in Belgrade, you couldn't call Zagreb. And I believe if you were in Sarajevo, you couldn't call either. But in all of those cities, you could call New York City. So what we did is we had all of them call in to WBAI and put them all on the air, speaking live with one another. So even though they couldn't actually, talk directly from Zagreb to Belgrade, they could talk directly over the airwaves of WBAI. So we actually did something, I believe, which was quite revolutionary and quite concrete in terms of, encouraging war resistance and ethnic coexistence in the former Yugoslavia in these extremely dark years. So one of the moments which I'm most proud of, through all of this, I became interested. I actually started getting up to speed on the history of Europe and the history of the Balkans and Southern Europe and Mediterranean Europe in particular, and the Muslim presence, which in the Balkans in particular is very, very much mixed up with the Gnostic presence, because there was a sort of a Gnostic group called the Bogomils in Bosnia who were they were the group which became the Bosnian Muslims when the Ottoman Turks took over in, I believe it would have been the 15th century. So another high point, which also was instrumental in my personal awakening to my own Moorish identity. Another high point of what the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade did in these years is we interviewed Sheikh Anwar Makin. Sounds like an Irish name, which was something which was very heartening to Peter, but in fact he is Nubian. And it seems to be some either remarkable coincidence or else actually evidence of some ancient Celtic Nubian connection that Makin is actually a Nubian name. And he considers himself to be the heir to the throne of the Kingdom of Nubia, which has now been incorporated into the state of Sudan. And he was a Sudanese dissident who had been exiled from his own country for opposing the extremely brutal fundamentalist regime which is in power there. He was, an advocate of freedom and cultural survival and autonomy for his own people, the Nubians, who were still being kicked around very, very badly by the Sudanese regime up in the Nuba Mountains in the south of what is now North Sudan. Back then, it was before, of course, it was all Sudan at that point. And very interestingly, we did this interview with him, again, the same period, this probably would have been around 94, 95, before anybody, really, outside of just a few people in Sudan and a few anthropologists and historians and so forth, hardly anybody had ever heard of a place called Darfur. And he told us way back in 94, 95, on the air of WBAI, that this was a place that we had to watch out for because the indigenous people there, the Four, Darfur means the land of the Four, the indigenous people are the Four, F-U-R, were being deported as slaves by the Sudanese regime, and that at a certain point they were going to take up arms. And of course, that was an extremely prophetic statement. And long before, a good 10 years before Darfur burst into the world's headlines, we heard about the struggle which was going on there from Sheikh Anwar Makin, the exiled king of Nubia, and Sudanese dissident over the airwaves of WBAI. So another high point, which I'm extremely proud of in this history. This is actually an interview which I jointly did with Peter Lamborn Wilson, as a matter of fact. So, again, as we throughout this period, I became finally, cognizant of my own Moorish roots on both sides of my family. As a matter of fact, it was 2002. I made my long-awaited pilgrimage to the homeland of my mother's people, which is Calabria in southern Italy, where I had never been before, and actually went to the village where my mom's peeps come from, up in the mountains of Calabria. And there had always been some family lore, which was taken sort of half seriously, that we had Saracen or Moorish roots on the Italian side. Italian on my mom's side and Jewish on my dad's side, Ashkenazic on my dad's side. So when I actually met my distant relatives in this village up in the mountains in Calabria, I found that, in fact, what had merely been sort of a rumor and family lore on this side of the Atlantic in New York City was well known in the actual village. I'm not going to reveal the name of the village. Up in the mountains in Calabria, that yes, in fact, this village had been built by the Moors, and had been one of course, in this period, everybody knows about the glories of Al-Andalus, which was the great Moorish kingdom and in fact the Moorish Caliphate in Spain during the same period. Well, this period being what was the so-called Dark Ages in Europe. Well, during these same centuries, there was also a Moorish kingdom in Sicily, which was actually loyal to the Fatimid Calamate based in Egypt, which adhered to the heretical Ismaili schism of Shiite Islam, heretical, quote unquote. So, they established certain footholds on the Italian mainland, in the southernmost region of the Italian mainland, of course, is Calabria. It's the toe of the boot, so to speak. And it seems that the village where my mom's peeps came from had, in fact, been one of these Moorish strongholds, which had been established on the mainland of Italy from the Moorish kingdom in Naples, with its capital at Palermo. Until as my relatives there put it, the armies of Constantinople came in and destroyed the old village and built the new village, when the new village being over 1,000 years old. So, which is the village which they still live in today, which is just across the river from the old village, and you can still see the ruins of the old village. So, I began to realize that, yes, in fact, I do, in fact, have legitimate Moorish roots on my mom's side, and I would argue that I became more and more aware of Moorish roots on my Ashkenazic side as well, more in a generalized sense, as opposed to a specific sense, as on the Italian side. But for starters, whether or not you believe, and this is a point of a great deal of controversy, whether or not you believe that the contemporary Eastern European Jews, the Ashkenazim, are in fact the descendants of the ancient Hebrews in a literal genetic sense. Well, to me, that strikes me as a rather irrelevant question. Clearly, there has been a continuous cultural transmission from the ancient Hebrews.
deden, neslin baban, ceddin deden, neslin baban, hep kahraman Türk milleti, orduları pek çok zaman vermiştiler. Dünya yaşam, orduları pek çok zaman vermiştiler. Dünya yaşam, ceddin deden.
So Hebrew is a Semitic language. The Semitic languages are part of a greater language group which is known as Afro-Asiatic, or sometimes it's called Erythrean, which also includes the indigenous languages of North Africa, Berber, or Amazigh, as it's known in its own tongue. So there is a lineage going back to the Moorish world, and even for the contemporary Ashkenazim, and also to the more greater Asiatic world, if the theories of Arthur Kessler in the 13th tribe are correct. The Ashkenazim actually trace their origin to the Khazars, who were a nomadic Turkic people from Central Asia, who established a kingdom in what is now contemporary Ukraine and southern Russia. And, contemporary, more serious scholars, such as Kevin Allen Brooke, who wrote The Jews of Khazaria, believe that probably Arthur Kessler's theories were a little bit overstated, but that nonetheless the Khazars were at least a significant element, a part of the ethnogenesis of the Ashkenazim. So what all this means to me, and it actually begins to tie in. I should wrap this up because we're running out of memory on the camera. I understand is. Well, for starters, that understanding the roots of the word anti-Semitism, the European anti-Semites saw the Jews as an alien, corrupting, Semitic, Asiatic, or African presence in Europe, and the entire sort of deal which constitutes sort of contemporary Jewish consensus reality and Zionism is that the state of Israel has made its peace with the West and with European power against the swarthy hordes of the Arab world, completely counterproductive to true Jewish interest, because European power will sell us out in a minute if the system goes into crisis, as history has amply demonstrated, and that really it's in the enlightened self-interest of Jews to throw in their lot with the oppressed of the world, which includes the Arabs and the Palestinians, and repudiate the European settler ideology of Zionism. And yet to not compromise an inch in our vigilance against anti-Semitism, which is the perfect segue into how I got purged from WBAI. Well, people who were listening to the final episodes of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade earlier this year, back in the spring, will be aware that in recent years, WBAI had been relying more and more on what I call snake oil premiums, fundraising premiums, where people would be, sent something in the mail as ostensibly as a thank you gift for their donation to WBAI. But in the fiscal crisis at WBAI, management saw fit to rely on a real hard sell approach for the premiums. And it wasn't really like a thank you gift for making a donation. It was more like selling an overpriced book or DVD. And then in the chaos around there, frequently they wouldn't even bother to send them out, which was just adding insult to injury. But what I really objected to was that much of these books and DVDs were loopy. On one hand, there was a lot of health quackery, and on the other hand, there was a lot of right-wing conspiracy theory, which began with all of this nonsense about, there was this DVD they did called The Money Masters, which was endorsed by Milton Friedman, the guru of the free market right, the real libertarians, the so-called, the right-wing free market libertarians, which was all about, the evil conspiracy of foreign bankers to undermine American sovereignty, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then there was, of course, a whole lot of, 9/11 conspiracy stuff, which some of it was being promoted by, outright sort of Nazi nostalgists, like Eric Hofschmied. If you go to his website, there's a whole bunch of Holocaust revisionism, Holocaust denial, as well as anti-immigrant xenophobia. And a guy by the name of David Icke, who actually holds that the world is secretly run by the Rothschilds, who are shape-shifting reptilians from another planet or another dimension. I kid you not. This is actually what he says. And this is what BAI was promoting. So I dissented from this in extremely forthright terms, shall we say. And for my efforts, I lost my radio show. And it was written up in the New York Times, and it was written up in Newsday, and I believe that I spoke truth to power and stood up for principle and did the right thing, and that I really didn't have any choice, ethically or politically speaking. I had no choice. I had to do what I did. And so here we are. We've lost the radio show, and we're now broadcasting on the Internet, just like lots of other people around the world have been relegated to cyberspace. Another thing that we've done is we have, after a long period of inactivity, we've revived the Libertarian Book Club. We've sort of been going through something of an identity crisis about the name, given that nobody understands what the word libertarian means anymore. People think it just means free market right, and in fact, for us it means libertarian left, or anti-authoritarian left. But the compromise we've decided on is that in the name of tradition, we are going to, and out of respect for the people who founded it back in 1946, we're keeping the name Libertarian Book Club, but the event, the ongoing lecture series that we do is going to be the Anarchist Forum, and that's going to be more of the organization's public face. So we revived the Anarchist Forum this spring. I did a speaking gig, and so did Peter Lamborn Wilson. And we are hoping to do so again in the fall, and hopefully, I have some very, very ambitious travel plans for the fall. If I can raise the money, I am hoping to pull them off and to come back and do a report back from somewhere in the heartland of the Moorish world for the Anarchist Forum in the fall. And I will have more to say about this in the next episode of the online edition of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade.